Alright guys, welcome back to Formula 1 news. After the progress Mercedes made at the Spanish Grand Prix, Red Bull boss Christian Horner said they must be running out of budget to continually improve this car, while also thinking about next year's W15. Toto Wolff says it's not a concern. Their upgrades are in line with what they would expect to achieve under this year's budget, and there's still plenty of room to make all the changes they want to next year's W15 to finally compete from the start of the season. Very much enjoyed to hear your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always. Firstly, big news today on potentially some new dates for races for the 2024 season. Firstly, actually, due to Ramadan, they're looking to move around some of the dates such that the Bahrain and Saudi Arabian Grand Prix might well move to a Saturday. They will be apparently the 2nd and the 9th of March respectively, both on a Saturday. We know that this season's Las Vegas Grand Prix is going to be on a Saturday because, you know, on the strip and all that, but obviously that's a very different time zone, so that's pretty interesting as an observation. That also means these are the rest of the dates. So Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, Australia, Japan apparently moving back far earlier in the year, such that it will be on the same lines as China, which will apparently actually be returning next year, but we'll see about that. So Suzuka far earlier in the season, 7th of April is the date that's going around, then China if it goes ahead, then Miami. Those are the first 5 or 6 races of the season. There also has been some discussions because China, you know, there's some debates about China, Taiwan, Russia, Ukraine, all this stuff that's going on right now. I don't really follow geopolitics and all this, but I know there's obviously been some conversations about that with China and Russia and whatever's going on there. So they're looking for a potential Korean Grand Prix replacement. That's one of the rumours as well, that we might go back to South Korea. That'd be pretty interesting instead of China at some point when, you know, pretty much after, I guess, 2025 onwards would be the discussion point there. Before we dive into the upgrades that plenty of teams are deciding to bring, a lot of what they do bring is dependent on how they can develop in the wind tunnel. These are going to be the testing hours allocated from now to the end of the year, from the 26th of June onwards. So this resets based on the current championship order standing positionings. So for example, Aston Martin, I think they were 7th were they last year's championship? So they had 1200 hours over the past 6 months, but now they will only have 960 hours. And if Lance Stroll was actually a pretty good driver, they'd probably only have 900 hours, right? Because they would be second theoretically. I think they have the second fastest car, but Mercedes are second, so they go down from 960 down to 900. Now Red Bull I think would have 840, but that's reduced by 10% based on the cost cap breach penalty, so they're at 756 hours, which is almost half of what Alpha Tauri now have, being the worst placed team. So effectively after the last race weekends, that's when after Canada everything resets and we get an order like this which determines which team gets the most testing time. I imagine there's some way to prevent Red Bull and Alpha Tauri, given they are owned both by the same parent company, for, you know, ensuring that there's no dodgy activities going on there, let's just say. I imagine there are procedures in place to prevent such a thing, but this is what it looks like. And Verstappen is definitely hoping that someone else is going to catch up at some point. I mean, he said, look, people are getting bored. I'm pretty much getting bored. I want some good competition here. It would be nice if someone else could catch up and we have some entertaining races. But Mercedes believe that Verstappen wasn't just cruising in Canada. They reckon that he didn't really have that much more pace to give. And even Verstappen said that, well, look, if I get the setup wrong one weekend, or if we get the setup wrong, or if our car doesn't suit this track, it would be quite nice if there was somebody else that could win. So Verstappen's getting bored of it, and you can understand it. And Mercedes will need to think, all right, we can keep developing this year's W14, but fundamentally, they want to get the W15 right and absolutely nail it so they can challenge the RB20 as it would be for next season. They currently believe, though, they're not far behind. They reckon they're 3/10 behind Red Bull's pace. This, to be honest, can be quite variable though, right? It depends massively on the specific circuit. Canada will be different to Spain. Austria, we're going next, will be different to Canada, and then Silverstone after that. So they reckon roughly the gap is 3/10 of a second, which, to be fair, compare it to the start of the season where the gap was 7/8 of a second, maybe in something like Bahrain. That's big progress. They reckon they're close, and even one engineer dares to say we are only an upgrade away from challenging for victory, with 2 upgrades planned before the summer break. So they reckon that Mercedes are 3/10 behind Red Bull. They reckon Aston are only 2/10 behind Red Bull. They reckon there's still a 10th to find to Aston Martin, and then Ferrari a further 10th behind that. So the engineers seem to believe that all the top 4 cars are within 4/10 of a second of each other when they're performing at their optimum, which is pretty exciting, but Red Bull still have the margin for now. We know though that Red Bull, and we saw this the other day, Christian Horner says, look, we're going to start focusing on next year now, right? To look at these numbers, numbers. Obviously, Red Bull have the reduction in time, which is pretty significant, but they're going to put a lot of this time into next year's development to try and forget the breach of cost cap penalty really ever affected them in the first place. But Mercedes are confident in the direction they're going. They say that the Monaco upgrades were just a prototype for a whole series of developments that they are now bringing to the car, and they reckon they're quite close to actually challenging Red Bull. The question was, though, that was raised after Spain, how much money did Mercedes have to explore this? The cost cap is a thing. They started out the season with a different car design, developing an entirely new one, bringing all the upgrades as a result, and still leaving enough money left over to ensure that next year's car is developed to its maximum potential is far from a guarantee. And Christian Horner made this point after Spain. He was like, are they sure they've got enough money for this? They've obviously committed a significant part of their budget cap to this upgrade. It's out of the team where it applies it. And basically Horner was like, well, you know, you guys were still 20 seconds behind us. I'm not too concerned. Turns out, though, Mercedes reckon Horner doesn't know what he's talking about here, saying that they effectively have everything managed with their cash flow such that they can proceed with all these upgrades they have planned for the W14 that will continue before and further onwards from the summer break, while still doing everything it wants to do for the W15. Toto Wolff says, we have set up a huge organisation in our financial department of 46 people that monitors the cost cap down to the last screw. Maybe almost a little, not exactly a dig at Red Bull, right? But given they breached it last year, I'm sure part of him saying, look, we actually monitor ours, whereas maybe other teams don't so well. It follows the trend of spending all during the year, and what we've done is basically allocated resource to various projects. We stayed below that line all year last year, and we've stayed below it all year this year. Considering a normal development switch for next year, this is still pretty much on track. Talks about the fundamental design changes they want to bring, and look, there's certain parts of the W14 they can't change. The chassis, bringing the cockpit back a little bit that Hamilton wants to happen, various other changes with potentially the rear suspension that's, given the gearbox is now designed as it is, they might not be able to change the suspension as much as they would like to, whereas next year they can redesign some parts and go at it again. So it doesn't really matter how many upgrades they bring to the W14, they don't have the money to bring an entirely new chassis, and therefore it's always going to be somewhat limited in its potential compared to what they believe next year's car can be. But Mercedes are saying, look, the budget gap is not a concern for us. I think, honestly, what saved them, and maybe will affect Ferrari, who knows, is that they realised very early on this year they needed to switch the concept. I think even before the Bahrain test, they knew that what they'd done wasn't really going to work, and they decided to go down a different route. So they didn't waste so much money on the previous concept that they could have done, and maybe Ferrari did, just because it's only been quite recently where Ferrari have decided, you know what, yeah, we probably do need to take some inspiration elsewhere. Their bathtub side pods have now kind of disappeared. They've got a new floor on the way, this type of stuff. So for Mercedes, probably in a better spot there. And they say, look, we don't have to worry about the W15. And Mercedes are very confident they've got all the money they need to still make the fundamental changes next year, but then still bring all the upgrades they want to this year. So Mercedes still do feel like the team that if there is going to be a team to challenge Red Bull, it's probably going to be them. Fundamentally, every championship has been won by either Red Bull or Mercedes for well over a decade at this point, right? You're looking back to 2008 for the last time a team that wasn't, I mean, what, Ferrari won the constructors that year, Hamilton won the drivers in a McLaren. Since then, every year it's been Red Bull or Mercedes. So, you know, maybe Aston can get there at some point, maybe Ferrari can get back there, but for the last 15 years, it's been one of those two teams winning everything. But Aston also have some plans up their sleeve as well. They kind of confirm what we talked about yesterday, that due to some tricky conditions in free practice, they didn't experiment with the setup that they fully wanted to, and they reckon there's even more lap time from its updates, right? So we saw yesterday that Aston reckoned that, okay, they weren't too far off the pace, especially if Alonso hadn't been managing, but if they really nailed their setup, they reckon they could have even been on the pace or faster than Red Bull at that specific track. So that's pretty exciting. Ferrari as well, they have a new floor on the way, a brand new one. They're pushing hard to generate this. Okay, we know that the last time Ferrari introduced a new floor, which was what, last year in France, it actually backfired quite spectacularly on them. But this time, maybe it's going to work. I guess we'll see. The Tifosi will certainly hope so. And this is meant to be one of their biggest updates for the remainder of the season. They are trying to fast track it and get it done quick, but it probably won't be there for Austria. Maybe Silverstone, with all the other teams bringing upgrades as well. That's where something might potentially happen. So we'll see. Red Bull got to 100 wins. They're actually not far off, overtaking Williams with 114 all-time. Then Mercedes, who kind of surprisingly only have 125. Hamilton has 103 of those. They only had a handful before they left the sport decades ago, and then of course they returned and have won quite a lot since. McLaren and then Ferrari still number one by a mile, but they haven't won since Austria last year, and we're going there very soon indeed. Just one thing to mention before we close out the video here, actually, on the tyre warmers. You guys might have seen lots of drama about this recently because for, I think, the fourth time in the last 15 years, Formula 1 are trying to ban the tyre warmers on the tyres. Now, I guess they mention energy and stuff like this. It's a bit of a questionable one, and I know people say, oh, well, you know, the drivers should be able to drive on the cold tyres, right, and manage that coming out of the pits. My primary issue with this is not necessarily that argument. It's more so what it means for strategy, because if you come into the pits, put on a set of hard tyres, and they're stone cold, you are going to lose at least 5 seconds on the outlap to the guy that's going out on tyres, or, you know, to the guy that's trying to do the overcut. So the idea of the undercut strategy, where you pit maybe an extra time, or you pit earlier than your rival to try and go faster on your outlap than he does on his inlap and make the overtake that way, that is no longer viable with the particularly cold tyres. The overcut will always be the better strategy, and a one-stop, let's say there's a race that's borderline one-stop, two-stop, it will always be a one-stop in that scenario, and I don't want that to be the case. So anyway, there's a few reasons why I'm not convinced by the whole idea of banning the tyre warmers, and it seems like the teams don't want it, the drivers don't want it. Once again, it's probably not going to happen. So very much interested to hear your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoyed, subscribe if you're new, take care, and I'll see you next time.